The church was perfect. White roses draped every pew, golden light streamed through stained glass windows, and the gentle hum of the organ filled the air. My wedding day should have been the happiest moment of my life. Instead, I stood at the altar feeling like a stranger at my own celebration. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. From the corner of my eye, I could see him in the front row. Richard Blackwood, my father, sat rigid in his charcoal suit, his face a mask of barely concealed disgust. When the pastor asked who gives this bride away, the silence stretched so long that guests began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. My stepmother, Elena, finally nudged him, and he stood with all the enthusiasm of someone attending a funeral. "I suppose I do," he muttered, the words dripping with reluctance. Then, just loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear, he added, "Though I never thought this worthless girl would find anyone desperate enough to marry her." The church fell silent. My fiancé, Marcus, squeezed my hand, his jaw clenched. The pastor cleared his throat awkwardly. But I kept my chin up, even as my heart shattered. This wasn't new. This was just the latest chapter in a lifetime of being invisible to the man who was supposed to love me unconditionally. My name is Sarah Blackwood, though I haven't used that last name in years. I've been invisible to my father since I was 12 years old, the day I chose to live with my mother after their bitter divorce. He remarried within 6 months to Elena, a woman 20 years younger with perfectly manicured nails and a daughter named Victoria, who became the golden child I never was. Growing up, I watched from the sidelines as Victoria received everything I had once dreamed of: private school tuition, riding lessons, designer dresses, and most painfully, our father's pride. When Victoria graduated valedictorian, Richard threw her a party at the country club. When I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in computer science, he sent a card with my name misspelled. The pattern continued through our 20s. Victoria's internship at his law firm made front page of the local newspaper. My acceptance into MIT's graduate program went unmentioned at family gatherings. When Victoria got engaged to a banker's son, Richard planned an elaborate engagement party. When I announced my engagement to Marcus, a high school teacher, he asked if we were sure we could afford a wedding. But what hurt most wasn't the favoritism. It was the complete erasure of who I really was. Richard saw me as his failure, the daughter who chose her mother's chaotic artistic household over his structured, successful world. What he didn't know was that I had been quietly building an empire in the shadows. While Victoria collected trophies and accolades, I had been coding late into the night, designing algorithms that would revolutionize cybersecurity. While she posed for society photos, I was filing patents under a pseudonym. While Richard dismissed me as his worthless daughter who would never amount to anything, I was becoming one of the most sought-after tech innovators in the country. The company I founded, Phoenix Security Solutions, operated completely under the radar. I used the name S. Phoenix on all documentation, communicating with clients through encrypted channels and handling meetings through video calls where I appeared as an avatar. The anonymity wasn't just about privacy. It was protection from a family that had spent years telling me I would never be successful. Phoenix Security had quietly become the backbone of cybersecurity for Fortune 500 companies. Banks, hospitals, government agencies, they all relied on the systems I had designed. When the largest data breach in history was prevented 6 months ago, it was my firewall that stopped it. When foreign hackers tried to infiltrate the power grid, my algorithms caught them. I had single-handedly prevented digital disasters that could have cost billions of dollars and countless lives. But to Richard, I was still the disappointing daughter who had made poor life choices. Even as I stood at that altar on my wedding day, wearing my grandmother's pearls and a dress I had paid for with money earned from contracts he couldn't even comprehend, he saw only failure. The reception was held at the historic Grandview Manor, a venue I had chosen specifically because Richard had once told me I'd be lucky to afford a backyard barbecue for my wedding. The ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and white orchids. A string quartet played softly as guests enjoyed dinner prepared by the city's most exclusive catering company. Marcus and I had paid for everything ourselves, though our guests assumed Richard had footed the bill. I watched him accept congratulations on throwing such an elegant affair, never bothering to correct anyone's assumptions. Elena glided between tables in her silk gown, playing the role of proud stepmother while shooting me looks that suggested she knew exactly how much this was all costing. During dinner, Richard stood to give his father of the bride speech. I held my breath, hoping that perhaps on this one day he might find something kind to say about his daughter. Sarah has always been determined to do things her own way, he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom. Even as a child, she was stubborn, choosing the harder path when easier options were available. She left our home to live with her mother, chose a state school over the private colleges I offered to pay for, and pursued a career in a field that, frankly, I don't understand. I felt Marcus's hand find mine under the table. Around us, guests looked uncomfortable as Richard's words grew sharper. But I suppose everyone has to find their own path, he continued, even if that path leads to mediocrity. Sarah has found a nice young man in Marcus, and perhaps he can provide the stability she's never been able to achieve on her own. To the bride and groom, may you be content with simple pleasures, since you've chosen simple lives. The toast was met with scattered applause and awkward silence. I smiled and nodded, playing the part of the grateful daughter, but inside, I was burning. Simple life? Mediocre path? If only he knew that the woman he dismissed so casually was protecting his own law firm's servers from cyber attacks on a weekly basis. As the evening wore on, I excused myself to the manor's library for a moment of quiet. The room was lined with leather-bound books and lit by warm table lamps. I sat in a wingback chair and pulled out my phone to check the encrypted messages that had been piling up all day. 3 new contract offers, a request for consultation from the Department of Defense, and a message from my assistant asking if I wanted to accept an interview request from Tech World magazine for their feature on the most influential cybersecurity innovators of the decade. I stared at that last message for a long time. Tech World was the most prestigious publication in the industry. An interview with them would mean stepping out of the shadows, revealing my identity to the world. It would mean Richard would finally know exactly who his worthless daughter really was. The library door opened, and Elena walked in, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "Hiding from your own reception?" she asked with false sweetness. "Just needed a moment to breathe," I replied, slipping my phone back into my purse. She studied me with calculating eyes. "You know, Richard really was disappointed that you chose such a modest venue. He had hoped you might have developed better taste by now." I almost laughed. The Grandview Manor was the most exclusive venue in the city, booked solid for 3 years in advance. But Elena's comment revealed how little she understood about the real cost of elegance versus the appearance of it. "I'm happy with my choices," I said simply. "Are you?" she pressed. "Don't you ever wonder what your life might have been like if you hadn't been so determined to prove a point? Victoria is already being considered for junior partner at the firm. She's building something real, something that will last."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
What do you have to show for all your rebellion? What did I have to show for it? Only the most advanced cybersecurity company in North America. Only algorithms that had prevented international incidents. Only a bank account that could have paid for 20 weddings at venues that would make Grandview Manor look quaint. But I said none of that. Instead, I stood and smoothed my dress. I should get back to my guests. As I walked past Elena toward the door, she made one final comment that would change everything. "I just hope you realize that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Your father may never say it, but he grieves for the daughter he lost, the one with potential." I stopped in the doorway, my hand on the brass handle. For 20 years, I had believed that my father's rejection was permanent, that nothing I accomplished would ever matter to him because I had chosen to leave. But Elena's words suggested something different. What if his dismissal wasn't about my achievements, but about his own hurt? What if the man who called me worthless was actually the one who felt abandoned? The revelation didn't excuse his behavior, but it opened a door I thought had been locked forever. As I returned to the ballroom where my new husband waited with a concerned smile, I made a decision that would reshape everything. It was time for S. Phoenix to step into the light, and when she did, the father who had spent decades calling his daughter worthless was going to discover that he had been dead wrong about everything. The honeymoon in Tuscany should have been perfect. Rolling hills dotted with vineyards, candlelit dinners under starry skies, and Marcus's gentle presence helping me forget the sting of my father's wedding speech. But even as we explored ancient villages and tasted wines that had aged longer than I'd been alive, I couldn't shake the weight of Elena's words or the decision crystallizing in my mind. On our third night, as Marcus slept peacefully beside me in our villa overlooking the valley, I slipped out to the terrace with my laptop. The time difference meant it was mid-afternoon in New York, perfect for the video call I'd been avoiding for weeks. Jennifer Walsh, editor-in-chief of Tech World magazine, appeared on my screen exactly at the scheduled time. She was sharp-eyed and direct, the kind of woman who had clawed her way to the top of a male-dominated industry through sheer brilliance and determination. "S. Phoenix," she said, leaning forward with interest. "I have to admit, when my team told me you'd finally agreed to an interview, I thought they were joking. You're more elusive than Banksy." I adjusted my position so the camera caught only shadows of my face. Anonymity has its advantages in cybersecurity. Trust is easier to build when egos aren't involved. Fair point, but our readers are fascinated by the person behind Phoenix Security Solutions. You've prevented more cyber disasters than any government agency, yet you operate completely off the grid. Some people think you don't actually exist. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was one of the most influential tech journalists in the world, desperate to interview someone my own father considered a failure. "What would you like to know?" Jennifer consulted her notes. "Let's start with the Meridian Bank hack last year. Sources tell me your system stopped what could have been the largest financial data breach in history. The FBI credited an anonymous tip, but industry insiders know it was Phoenix Security's algorithms that caught the intrusion." I remembered that night vividly. I'd been at Victoria's birthday party, watching Richard beam with pride as she cut her cake and announced her engagement. Meanwhile, my phone was buzzing with emergency alerts as hackers attempted to infiltrate Meridian's servers. I'd excused myself to the bathroom and spent 20 minutes on my laptop, tracing the attack's origin and deploying countermeasures that would later save 12 million customers from identity theft. The attack was sophisticated, I told Jennifer. State-sponsored, probably. They'd been planning it for months, mapping vulnerabilities and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But they made one crucial mistake. They assumed traditional security measures would be their only obstacle. And your solution? Adaptive defense algorithms. Instead of building walls, I created systems that learn and evolve. When hackers try to break in, the security measures actually get stronger, using their own attack patterns against them. Jennifer's eyes lit up. Revolutionary! And you developed this technology completely independently? I've always worked better alone. Corporate environments tend to stifle innovation with bureaucracy and committee decisions. When you're protecting critical infrastructure, there's no time for office politics. We talked for another hour about various cases: the hospital network I'd secured from ransomware attacks, the power grid vulnerabilities I'd patched, the election systems I'd helped fortify. With each story, I watched Jennifer become more animated, more impressed. This woman understood the magnitude of what I'd accomplished, even if my own family never would. After ending the call, I sat on the terrace until dawn, watching the sun paint the Tuscan hills gold. Marcus found me there with my coffee, still in my pajamas, staring at the landscape with unseeing eyes. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, settling into the chair beside me. "Just thinking about your father's speech," I admitted, "about what Elena said afterward." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He'd witnessed Richard's cruelty firsthand, but he'd also grown up with loving parents who celebrated his achievements. The concept of a father calling his daughter worthless was foreign to him. "You know none of what he said was true, right?" he finally said. "Sarah, you're the most accomplished person I know. The work you do, the lives you've saved. Even if he can't see it, it matters." I turned to look at my new husband, this gentle man who taught high school chemistry and coached the debate team, who believed in nurturing young minds and making small differences that rippled outward. He knew about my work, though not the full extent of it. Like everyone else, he assumed I was a freelance security consultant who did well enough to afford our comfortable lifestyle. "What if I told you I was considering going public?" I asked. "Really public, revealing everything about Phoenix Security Solutions." His eyebrows rose. "That's a big step. You've always said anonymity was your protection." Maybe it's time I stopped hiding. The decision felt inevitable, like a tide that had been building for years and was finally ready to break. I'd spent so long protecting myself from Richard's judgment that I'd forgotten there was a world beyond his narrow vision, a world that would value what I'd built. When we returned from Italy, I threw myself into preparation with the intensity I usually reserved for cyber emergencies. If I was going to reveal my identity, it had to be spectacular, not out of ego, but because the truth needed to be undeniable. First, I compiled documentation of every major case Phoenix Security had handled. Bank records showing the millions of dollars in damages prevented, government contracts proving my involvement in national security initiatives, client testimonials from Fortune 500 CEOs who credited my work with saving their companies. The evidence was staggering, even to me. Over 7 years, I'd generated over $200 million in prevented losses. My algorithms were running on servers across 3 continents. I held 37 patents in cybersecurity technology, all filed under carefully constructed shell companies. But numbers and documents weren't enough. I needed something that would make Richard understand not just what I'd accomplished, but who I'd become. That's when I remembered the Blackwood and Associates incident. 2 years ago, Richard's law firm had been targeted by a sophisticated phishing attack. Someone had gained access to their client database and was threatening to release sensitive legal documents unless the firm paid a substantial ransom. The attack had nearly destroyed Richard's reputation and cost him several high-profile clients. What Richard didn't know was that the attack had been stopped not by the expensive security firm he'd hired, but by his worthless daughter working through the night from her apartment. I'd traced the hackers, neutralized their access, and recovered the stolen data. The security firm had taken credit, and Richard had never questioned their story. I pulled up the case files, documented with timestamps and digital signatures that proved my involvement. Here was concrete evidence that I'd saved my father's career while he was publicly dismissing mine. My assistant at Phoenix Security, David Chen, was the only person who knew my real identity. When I called him into my home office that Monday morning, he looked nervous. "I need you to schedule a press conference," I told him without preamble. David nearly dropped his coffee. "A what now?" "Tech World wants to do a cover story. I'm going to give them exclusive access to everything, my identity, my background, the full scope of Phoenix Security's operations." He sat down heavily. "Sarah, are you sure about this? Once you're public, there's no going back. Every government agency, every competitor, every hacker who's ever been blocked by your systems will know exactly who you are." "I'm tired of being invisible," I said. "My own father called me worthless at my wedding because he has no idea who I actually am. It's time that changed." David studied my face, recognizing the determination he'd seen before major operations. "Okay, what's the timeline?" 2 weeks. I want it coordinated with the Tech World article and a demonstration that will make it impossible for anyone to doubt what I've accomplished." We spent the next 10 days in constant motion. Jennifer Walsh and her team conducted extensive interviews, photographed my home office with its wall of monitors and advanced encryption hardware, and verified every claim with independent sources. The fact-checking process was exhausting, but necessary. Meanwhile, I prepared for the demonstration that would serve as the grand finale. I'd identified a vulnerability in the city's traffic management system. Nothing dangerous, just a minor flaw that could theoretically be exploited to cause confusion. During the press conference, I would hack into the system live, demonstrate the vulnerability, and then immediately patch it, all while explaining the process to the audience. The night before the press conference, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Marcus slept beside me. Tomorrow, everything would change. The daughter Richard had written off as a failure would be revealed as one of the most influential cybersecurity experts in the world. The simple life he'd mocked would be exposed as a carefully constructed cover for work that protected millions of people. I thought about calling him, giving him some warning about what was coming. But then I remembered his toast at my wedding, the years of dismissal and contempt, the way he'd let everyone assume he was paying for a celebration I'd funded myself. No, he would find out the same way everyone else did. And when he did, the man who had called me worthless would finally understand exactly how wrong he'd been about everything. The morning sun was streaming through our bedroom windows when Marcus stirred awake and found me already dressed in the navy suit I'd chosen for the press conference. "Ready?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. I looked at myself in the mirror one last time. Today, Sarah Blackwood would step out of the shadows. And tonight, the whole world would know that the worthless daughter was actually the woman who'd been keeping them safe all along. The Marriott ballroom buzzed with anticipation as technology reporters, cybersecurity executives, and government officials filled every seat. I stood backstage, watching through a gap in the curtains as camera crews made final adjustments and photographers tested their lighting. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands were steady. This was just another operation, I told myself, the biggest one of my career. Jennifer Walsh took the podium first, her voice cutting through the chatter like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, for 7 years, the cybersecurity world has been protected by a ghost. Someone who has prevented data breaches that could have cost billions, stopped attacks on critical infrastructure, and revolutionized how we think about digital defense. Today, that ghost steps into the light." I heard my cue and walked onto the stage, no longer hiding behind avatars or encrypted communications. The room fell silent as I approached the microphone, and I could see recognition flickering in some faces. A few people in the tech community had suspected S. Phoenix might be a woman, but none had imagined she was standing right in front of them. "My name is Sarah Blackwood," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "And for the past 7 years, I've been operating under the identity of S. Phoenix, founder and CEO of Phoenix Security Solutions." The room erupted. Cameras flashed, reporters leaned forward in their seats, and I caught sight of David Chen in the wings, grinning despite his earlier concerns about going public. But what I didn't see, what I hadn't expected, was the familiar figure slipping through the back doors of the ballroom. My father stood at the rear of the room, his face pale with shock. Elena clutched his arm, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into his suit jacket. They must have seen the news alerts, the social media posts from tech reporters announcing that the mysterious S. Phoenix was finally revealing her identity. But nothing could have prepared Richard for the reality of seeing his worthless daughter standing on that stage. I continued with my presentation, clicking through slides that showed Phoenix Security's portfolio, the Meridian bank hack that I'd stopped while he celebrated Victoria's birthday, the hospital ransomware attack I'd neutralized during Christmas dinner 2 years ago, the foreign interference in election systems that I'd detected and reported while listening to him lecture Marcus about choosing more ambitious career goals. Cybersecurity isn't just about building better firewalls, I explained to the audience. It's about understanding that the digital world and the physical world are no longer separate entities. When hackers attack a power grid, they're not just stealing data, they're threatening the safety of every person who depends on the electricity. When they breach a hospital system, they're putting patients' lives at risk. I demonstrated my adaptive defense algorithms live, showing how they learned from attempted intrusions and became stronger with each attack. The technical sophistication was beyond what most audience members could fully grasp, but they understood enough to recognize genius when they saw it. Then came the moment I'd been preparing for since deciding to go public. I pulled up a case study that made several people in the front row gasp with recognition. 2 years ago, Blackwood & Associates, a prominent law firm here in the city, fell victim to a sophisticated spear phishing attack. The hackers gained access to sensitive client files and demanded ransom payment to prevent their release. The attack threatened not just the firm's reputation, but the privacy and safety of their clients, some of whom were involved in high-profile criminal cases. I could feel my father's stare burning into the back of my skull, but I kept my eyes on the presentation screen. The security firm hired to handle the breach was competent but conventional. They would have eventually resolved the situation, but not before significant damage was done. Instead, the attack was neutralized within 6 hours by Phoenix Security Solutions. The hackers' access was terminated, their stolen data was recovered, and their identities were traced and reported to federal authorities. The room was silent, except for the soft clicking of keyboards as reporters frantically took notes. I clicked to the next slide, which showed the digital forensics evidence, time-stamped and verified by independent sources. The interesting thing about this case was that Phoenix Security Solutions was never officially hired. The work was done pro bono, without the client's knowledge, because sometimes protecting people matters more than getting credit. I finally turned to look at the back of the room. Richard stood frozen, his face cycling through emotions I'd never seen there before: shock, confusion, and something that might have been awe. Elena had gone completely white, her hand pressed to her throat as if she couldn't breathe. The presentation concluded with a live demonstration of my latest innovation, a real-time threat detection system that could identify and neutralize cyber attacks across multiple networks simultaneously. As I typed commands that appeared on the giant screen behind me, I narrated the process for the audience, but part of my attention was focused on my parents at the back of the room. Richard was talking rapidly to Elena, his hands gesturing sharply. I caught fragments of his words carried on the ballroom's acoustics. "She saved us." I had no idea. How could we not know? The demonstration concluded successfully, drawing thunderous applause from an audience that finally understood they'd been watching history being made. During the question and answer session that followed, I fielded inquiries about Phoenix Security's future, my educational background, and my plans for expanding operations. One reporter asked the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. "Miss Blackwood, your father, Richard Blackwood, is a well-known attorney in this city. Has your family been supportive of your career in cybersecurity?" The ballroom went quiet. Everyone knew this was personal territory, the kind of moment that could define how my story would be remembered. I could have deflected, given a diplomatic answer about privacy and family matters. Instead, I decided to tell the truth. "My family had no knowledge of my work with Phoenix Security Solutions," I said carefully. "They were told I was a freelance IT consultant. For many years, they believed I had chosen a simple, unremarkable career path. In fact, at my wedding last month, my father expressed his disappointment that I hadn't achieved more with my life." A murmur ran through the crowd. I could see reporters' eyes lighting up as they sensed a deeper story unfolding. "Sometimes the people closest to us see only what they expect to see," I continued. "My father is a brilliant attorney who has built an impressive career through hard work and dedication, but he's also someone who equates visibility with value, recognition with worth. Because my work was necessarily anonymous, he assumed it was also insignificant." I paused, gathering courage for what came next. The irony is that while he was dismissing my career as meaningless, I was protecting his. Phoenix Security Solutions has quietly safeguarded many businesses and institutions in this city, including Blackwood and Associates. Sometimes, the most important work is the kind that goes unnoticed until something goes wrong. The press conference ended 20 minutes later, but the real confrontation was just beginning. As reporters packed up their equipment and attendees filed out, I saw my father pushing through the crowd toward the stage. His face was pale but determined, and Elena trailed behind him looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. "Sarah," he called out as I stepped down from the platform. His voice was different somehow, less commanding than I'd ever heard it. "We need to talk." I looked at this man who had shaped so much of my life through his absence, his criticism, his inability to see who I really was. For 32 years, I'd been seeking his approval while simultaneously building walls to protect myself from his rejection. Now, faced with undeniable proof of my accomplishments, he looked smaller somehow, less intimidating. "Do we?" I asked quietly. "After all these years, what is there left to say?" He struggled for words, this attorney who had built his reputation on eloquent arguments and persuasive rhetoric. "I didn't know," he finally managed. "How could I not have known?"
Because you never asked, I replied. You decided who I was when I was 12 years old, and nothing I did afterward could change your mind. When I graduated summa cum laude, you assumed it was a fluke. When I bought my house, you assumed Marcus was supporting me. When I paid for my own wedding, you let everyone think you were being generous. Elena stepped forward, her face flushed with embarrassment. Sarah, if we had known about your success, things would have been different. Would they? I challenged. Or would you have found new reasons to dismiss what I'd accomplished? Would you have said I was lucky, or that I'd chosen an unusual field, or that real success required public recognition? Richard was shaking his head slowly, like a man waking up from a long dream. The company you built, the lives you've saved, the money you must have earned. How did we miss all of it? You missed it because you weren't looking, I said. You were so busy being disappointed in who you thought I was that you never bothered to discover who I actually am. Behind us, the ballroom was nearly empty now, except for David Chen, who was pretending to pack equipment while clearly eavesdropping on our conversation. Marcus had texted that he was waiting in the lobby, giving me space to handle this confrontation alone. I want to make this right, Richard said suddenly. There has to be a way to fix this. I studied his face, looking for the sincerity I'd craved as a child. What I saw was a man genuinely shaken by the discovery that he'd been catastrophically wrong about his own daughter. But I also saw someone who still thought problems could be solved with the right legal strategy, relationships repaired with the proper negotiation. Some things can't be fixed with a new contract, I told him. You can't unsay what you said at my wedding. You can't undo 32 years of making me feel invisible. And you can't claim credit now for achievements you spent decades dismissing.
His shoulders sagged as the weight of those years settled on him. Then what do we do now? I looked at this man who had given me life but never really knew me, who had provided a home but never made me feel welcome in it. The anger I'd carried for so long felt different now, less sharp but somehow heavier. Now you know who I really am, I said simply. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. The reporters were gone, but the story was just beginning. By evening, my face would be on the cover of every major tech publication. My phone was already buzzing with interview requests, speaking invitations, and business opportunities. The invisible daughter had become impossible to ignore. But as I walked through the empty ballroom toward the exit where my husband waited, I realized that the validation I'd sought for so long felt different than I'd expected. Richard's shocked recognition hadn't healed the wounds of childhood. His pale, shaken face hadn't erased the years of dismissal. What mattered was that I had finally stopped hiding from my own truth. The world now knew that S. Phoenix and Sarah Blackwood were the same person. And whether my father ever fully understood what he'd lost, I had found something far more valuable than his belated approval. I had found myself. The story broke at 6 p.m., and by 7:30, my phone had died from the constant stream of calls, texts, and notifications. Marcus plugged it into the charger while I sat on our couch, watching my face appear on the evening news alongside headlines that still felt surreal. Local woman revealed as legendary cybersecurity expert. The Ghost in the Machine, how Sarah Blackwood became S. Phoenix. From worthless to priceless, a daughter's secret success. The irony of that last headline wasn't lost on me. Some journalist had clearly done their homework, digging up details about my family dynamics that I hadn't shared during the press conference. Richard's wedding toast was already making rounds on social media, with users expressing outrage at how he'd treated his accomplished daughter. Marcus settled beside me with 2 cups of tea, his steady presence anchoring me in the surreal aftermath of exposure. "How are you feeling?" I considered the question seriously. For years, I'd imagined this moment would bring vindication, a rush of satisfaction at finally proving my worth to the people who'd dismissed me. Instead, I felt oddly hollow, like I'd been carrying a heavy weight for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to put it down. "Different," I said finally. "Not better or worse, just different." My laptop chimed with another interview request, this one from CNN. The producer wanted me to appear on their morning show to discuss women in technology and family expectations. I closed the email without responding.
There would be time for media obligations later. Tonight, I just wanted to process what had happened. The doorbell rang at 8:15. Through the peephole, I saw Victoria standing on our front step, still wearing her work clothes but looking disheveled in a way I'd never seen before. Her usually perfect blonde hair was mussed, and her makeup had smudged around her eyes. I opened the door cautiously. We hadn't spoken since my wedding, and before that, our interactions had been limited to stilted pleasantries at family gatherings. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice smaller than I remembered. I stepped aside, and she entered our living room like she was walking through a minefield. Marcus excused himself diplomatically, claiming he needed to grade papers in his study. Victoria perched on the edge of our armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she looked up at me with eyes that held an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "I saw the news," she said unnecessarily. I figured. Another silence stretched between us. When she spoke again, her words came in a rush, like she'd been rehearsing them but couldn't quite get them right. "I always thought you were running away. From responsibility, from success, from the life Dad wanted for us. I thought you were taking the easy path, choosing mediocrity over achievement. I thought I was the one carrying the family legacy while you were just coasting." I waited, sensing there was more. "But you were saving Dad's law firm while I was at my birthday party. You were protecting hospitals while I was complaining about my workload. You were preventing disasters while I was taking credit for landing junior partner." Her voice cracked on the last words. "You were doing more than all of us combined, and we treated you like you were nothing." The raw pain in her voice caught me off guard. I'd expected anger, defensiveness, maybe jealousy. I hadn't expected this broken honesty. "Victoria, you didn't know." "That's just it," she interrupted. "I didn't want to know. It was easier to believe you'd failed than to consider that maybe you'd succeeded in ways I couldn't understand. It made me feel better about myself, thinking I was the good daughter, the one who made Dad proud." She stood up abruptly, pacing to our window that looked out over the city lights. "Do you know what it's like to realize that everything you thought about your life, your family, your own worth was built on a lie?" I did know, actually. I'd spent 32 years believing I was the disappointment, the failure, the daughter who couldn't measure up. The revelation that I'd been protecting the very people who dismissed me had its own cruel irony. "What does Dad say about all this?" I asked. Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He's locked himself in his study since we got home from the press conference. Elena keeps trying to talk to him, but he won't come out. I think he's trying to figure this, how to fix this. But you can't litigate your way out of 30 years of being wrong about your own daughter." She turned back to face me, and I saw something I'd never seen in Victoria before: uncertainty. She'd always moved through the world with confidence, secure in her place as the favored daughter. Now that security had been shattered. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to be your sister when I've spent so long being your replacement." The honesty in that statement hit me like a physical blow. She was right. Richard had essentially replaced me with her, transferring all his parental pride and investment to the daughter who'd stayed, who'd followed his prescribed path to success. "You were never my replacement," I said quietly. "You were just a daughter trying to earn her father's love. That's not your fault."
"But I enjoyed it," she whispered. "Being the favorite, being the one he bragged about. Part of me liked that you weren't there to compete with." The admission hung in the air between us. It was ugly and honest and probably necessary. I thought about the 12-year-old girl I'd been when I chose to live with my mother, how I'd watched Victoria step into the space I'd vacated. She'd been 8 years old, young enough to adapt to being the center of Richard's attention without questioning what had happened to the daughter who'd come before her. "We were both children," I said finally. "Children trying to survive in a family that was falling apart. You found your place by being what he wanted. I found mine by leaving. Neither of us chose to hurt the other." Victoria sank back into the armchair, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "I saw the footage of him at your wedding, the toast he gave. I was embarrassed for him, but I didn't say anything. I should have said something." "What would you have said?" "That he was wrong. That even if I didn't understand what you did for work, I could see that you were happy, that Marcus loved you, that you'd built something good. I should have defended you. I sat down on the couch across from her, studying this woman who'd been both my sister and my rival, without either of us choosing those roles. It wouldn't have changed anything. He had to see the truth for himself. And now he has, she said. The question is, what happens next? That question had been haunting me since I'd walked off that stage. The press conference had achieved what I'd hoped. Richard finally knew who I really was. But knowing and understanding were different things, and forgiveness was something else entirely. I don't know if I want a relationship with him, I admitted. It was the first time I'd spoken those words aloud, even to myself. For 30 years, he's made it clear that I wasn't enough, wasn't worthy of his attention or pride. Now that he knows about my success, he wants to make amends. But what does that really mean? Is he sorry for how he treated me, or is he just sorry he missed out on claiming credit for my achievements? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, processing the question that went to the heart of family dynamics and conditional love. I think he's genuinely shocked, she said finally. Not just about your work, but about how wrong he was. You have to understand, Dad's whole identity is built on being right, on being the smartest person in the room. Finding out he completely misjudged his own daughter for 3 decades, that's not something he can just incorporate into his worldview. That's his problem to solve, not mine. You're right, she agreed, surprising me. But Sarah, if you decide you want to try, with him, with our family, I want you to know that I'll support that. And if you decide you don't want to try, I'll support that too. The offer was unexpected and more valuable than she probably realized. For years, Victoria had been the bridge between Richard and the rest of the world, his interpreter and defender. Having her acknowledge that his treatment of me was wrong, that my response was justified, felt like a form of validation I hadn't known I needed. I appreciate that, but I need time to figure out what I actually want, separate from what I think I should want. She nodded, standing to leave. At the door, she paused and turned back. For what it's worth, I'm proud of you. I'm proud to be the sister of someone who saved lives, who's built something extraordinary, who had the courage to step out of the shadows and claim credit for her work. I should have said that a long time ago. After she left, I sat in the quiet of our living room, processing a conversation I'd never expected to have. Marcus emerged from his study, settling beside me on the couch. How did it go? Better than I thought it would, I said. She apologized, really apologized, not just for tonight, but for years of being complicit in my erasure. That's something. It is, but it also makes me realize that the hardest conversations are still ahead of me. My phone, now fully charged, showed 47 missed calls and over 200 text messages. Among them were several from Richard's number, each message growing more desperate in tone. The first simply said, "We need to talk." The most recent, sent just 20 minutes ago, read, "Please, I know I have no right to ask, but please give me a chance to explain." I showed the messages to Marcus, who read them with a frown. What do you want to do? It was the same question Victoria had essentially asked, the one I'd been avoiding all evening. What did I want? Not what I thought I should want, not what would look good for the cameras or make for a tidy ending to my story, but what would actually serve my well-being and healing. I want to hear what he has to say, I said slowly, the decision crystallizing as I spoke it. Not because I owe him forgiveness, but because I need to understand whether he's actually changed or if this is just damage control. And if it's damage control? I looked at my husband, this steady man who'd supported me through years of family pain without ever trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. Then I'll know for certain that I made the right choice when I stopped seeking his approval, I said. Either way, I'll have my answer. Marcus nodded, understanding that some conversations had to happen, regardless of their outcome. Outside our window, the city glittered with lights, each one representing lives and stories as complicated as my own. Somewhere out there, Richard Blackwood was sitting in his study, trying to figure out how to repair a relationship he'd spent 3 decades dismantling. Tomorrow, I would find out if he'd learned the difference between being sorry and being changed. Tonight, I was finally ready to listen to what he had to say. I chose neutral ground for our meeting,
the Metropolitan Library downtown, third-floor reading room where conversations were limited to whispers and confrontations couldn't escalate. Richard arrived 15 minutes early, which didn't surprise me. Punctuality was one of his few consistent virtues, along with perfectly pressed shirts and an inability to admit when he was wrong. Today, however, something was different about his appearance. His usually immaculate hair showed traces of gray I'd never noticed, and his expensive suit looked like he'd slept in it. He stood when he saw me approach, an old-fashioned gesture that felt absurd given our circumstances. We were estranged father and daughter, not business associates conducting a formal negotiation. Sarah. He said my name like he was testing how it felt on his tongue.
Thank you for agreeing to see me. I took the seat across from him at the long oak table, noting how he'd chosen a spot far from other library patrons. Even in his apparent humility, Richard Blackwood was managing the optics of our conversation. You said you needed to explain something, I said without preamble. I'm listening. He folded his hands on the table, a gesture I remembered from childhood when he was about to deliver a lecture about responsibility or consequences. But instead of launching into attorney mode, he sat quietly for several seconds, as if gathering courage. I've spent the last 3 days reading everything I could find about Phoenix Security Solutions, he began. Every article, every case study, every interview you've given since the press conference. Do you know what struck me most? I waited. You never once mentioned your family. In all those interviews about your background, your motivation, your journey to success, you talked about your education, your mentors, your early struggles in the tech industry, but when reporters asked about your support system, about who believed in you during the difficult years, you talked about Marcus, about your mother, about colleagues and friends. You never mentioned me, not even to criticize me. Would you have preferred that I aired our family business in the media? I would have preferred that there was something positive to air, he said quietly. Sarah, I need you to understand something. When you chose to live with your mother after the divorce, it wasn't just a custody arrangement for me. It felt like a rejection of everything I'd tried to build, everything I thought was important. I felt the familiar surge of anger that had sustained me through years of his dismissal. I was 12 years old, Dad. I was a child caught between two parents who couldn't be in the same room without screaming at each other. I chose the home where I felt safe. I know that now, he said, his voice barely audible in the library's hushed atmosphere. But at the time, all I could see was that my daughter had picked her mother's chaos over my stability, her artistic dreams over my practical success. I felt like I'd failed as a father before you even became a teenager. The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or strategic vulnerability. What I saw instead was exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying a burden too long. So you decided to write me off entirely? I decided to protect myself from further rejection, he said. Every time you accomplished something, graduating college, starting your business, buying your house, I told myself it wasn't real success because it didn't look like the kind of success I understood. Law degrees, corporate partnerships, public recognition. When you chose a different path, I convinced myself it was because you weren't capable of achieving more. Even when I tried to tell you about my work, he winced. You remember the Christmas dinner when you mentioned working with banks and hospitals? I cut you off and changed the subject to Victoria's promotion at the firm. I thought you were exaggerating, maybe trying to make your IT consulting sound more important than it was. The memory was sharp and painful. I'd been so excited to share news of a major contract, and he'd dismissed me in front of the entire family. That was the night I stopped trying to explain my work to anyone who knew me before Phoenix Security. I wasn't lying, Dad. I was never lying. I know, he said, and for the first time in our conversation, his voice cracked slightly. Sarah, I spent 30 years being wrong about the most important thing in my life, my own daughter. Do you have any idea what that feels like? Do you have any idea what it felt like to be that daughter? The question silenced him. I could see him processing the implications, perhaps for the first time considering my experience rather than his own wounded pride. Tell me, he said finally. I hadn't expected that response. In all my imagined versions of this conversation, Richard had remained defensive, justifying his actions or minimizing their impact.
I hadn't prepared for him to actually ask about my pain. It felt like disappearing, I said slowly. Like no matter what I accomplished, I would always be invisible to the person whose opinion mattered most. Do you know that I used to practice conversations with you in my car before family gatherings? I would rehearse ways to tell you about my work that might finally make you proud. And every single time, you would find a way to dismiss what I'd done or redirect the conversation to Victoria. He closed his eyes, as if my words were physically painful. At my wedding, I continued, when you called me worthless in front of everyone I cared about, it wasn't surprising. It was just the final confirmation of what I'd suspected my entire adult life. That nothing I did would ever be enough for you because you'd decided I wasn't worth your attention when I was 12 years old. I was angry, he said quietly. At the wedding, I mean. You'd paid for everything yourself, planned this elaborate celebration, and I realized I didn't know anything about how you could afford it. Instead of being proud that my daughter was successful enough to fund her own wedding, I felt excluded, like you were showing off, proving you didn't need me. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was trying to have the wedding I wanted without asking for help from someone who'd made it clear he thought I was a disappointment. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 3 decades of misunderstanding settling around us like dust. Other library patrons moved quietly through the stacks, absorbed in their own research and discoveries, unaware that 2 people were attempting to excavate the remains of a relationship buried under years of hurt. The law firm, Richard said suddenly. 2 years ago, when we were attacked by those hackers, you saved us, didn't you? I nodded. Why? The question was simple, but the answer was complicated. Why had I spent an entire night protecting the business of a man who'd spent years dismissing my capabilities? Why risk exposing my identity to help someone who'd never helped me? Because it was the right thing to do, I said. Your clients didn't deserve to have their private information stolen because of a cybersecurity failure. Your employees didn't deserve to lose their jobs because of a data breach. And despite everything between us, I didn't want to watch your life's work get destroyed. You could have let us handle it ourselves, let us face the consequences. I could have, but that's not who I am. He studied my face as if seeing me clearly for the first time. You're better than me, he said. You protected people who'd hurt you.
I couldn't even protect the daughter who needed my support. The admission was so unexpected, so contrary to everything I knew about Richard Blackwood's ego and self-image, that I found myself speechless. This was the man who'd never admitted fault in a legal argument, who'd built his reputation on being right. And here he was, acknowledging not just that he'd been wrong, but that I'd been the better person. I don't need you to diminish yourself to build me up, I said. That's not what this is about. Then what is it about? I considered the question, trying to separate what I actually needed from what I thought I should want. I need to understand whether you see me as I actually am, or whether you're just adjusting your opinion now that you know about my professional success. Are you proud of Sarah Blackwood, or are you impressed by S. Phoenix? He was quiet for a long time, wrestling with a question that went to the heart of unconditional love versus conditional acceptance. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful. I wish I could tell you that I'm proud of you regardless of your achievements, that I should have valued you for your character and kindness rather than your career. But the honest answer is that I needed to see evidence of your success in terms I could understand before I was willing to reconsider my assumptions. The honesty was brutal, but also somehow cleansing. So many of our family conversations had been built on polite lies and unspoken resentments. This raw admission of his limitations was more valuable than false reassurances. That's not enough, I said quietly. I can't build a relationship with someone who only values me when I meet their definition of achievement. I know, he said, but Sarah, I want to try to be better. I want to learn how to see you for who you are, not just what you've accomplished. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm asking for one anyway. I looked at this man who'd shaped so much of my life through his absence, his criticism, his inability to understand that love shouldn't require performance metrics. The anger I'd carried for so long felt different now, less sharp, but still present. What would that look like? I asked. This better version of our relationship? I don't know, he admitted. I've been a father who measured love and achievements for so long that I'm not sure I know how to be anything else. But I want to learn.
Maybe we could start with dinner occasionally. Maybe I could ask you about your work, not because I'm trying to evaluate its worth, but because I'm genuinely interested in understanding what you do. And if I'm not ready for that, if the damage is too extensive to repair, then I'll respect that decision, he said. But I hope you'll consider the possibility that people can change, even people as stubborn and wrong as me. I thought about Victoria's unexpected apology, about the years of family gatherings where I'd felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I thought about the little girl who'd practiced conversations with her father in the car, hoping to finally say something that would make him proud. That girl deserved to know whether he was capable of growth, whether the father she'd longed for could still emerge from the man who'd disappointed her. One dinner, I said, somewhere public with Marcus present. You can ask me about my work and I'll answer your questions. But Dad, if you use that dinner as an opportunity to take credit for my success, to claim that your tough love somehow made me stronger, or to minimize the impact of how you've treated me, there won't be a second dinner. I understand. And you need to understand that forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. Even if we manage to build something new, I won't pretend that the past 30 years didn't happen. You hurt me, repeatedly and deliberately. That's part of our story now. I wouldn't want you to forget, he said. If you did, I might convince myself that it wasn't as bad as it was. We left the library separately, agreeing to meet the following week at a restaurant that specialized in quiet conversation and discreet service. As I walked to my car, I felt the strange sensation of carrying less weight than when I'd arrived. Not because Richard had earned my forgiveness, but because I'd finally been able to articulate exactly what I needed from him. The rest was up to him. The week that followed brought a whirlwind of professional opportunities that reminded me why I'd built Phoenix Security in the first place. CNN wanted a monthly cybersecurity segment. The Department of Homeland Security reached out about a consulting contract. 3 major tech companies made acquisition offers that would have made me wealthy beyond anything I'd imagined as a child dreaming of my father's approval. But the most meaningful offer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, director of the computer science program at the local university, called on Thursday morning with a proposition. We're launching a new initiative, she explained, cybersecurity education for underrepresented students, with a focus on first-generation college students and women. We need someone who understands both the technical challenges and the personal barriers that can keep talented people from pursuing careers in technology. It sounds like important work. It is. And frankly, after reading about your story, about how your family didn't understand your achievements, we think you'd be the perfect person to mentor students who might be facing similar challenges at home. I accepted the position before she finished outlining the details. Teaching had never been part of my career plan, but the idea of helping young women avoid the isolation I'd experienced felt like a natural extension of the work I'd been doing to protect people through technology. The dinner with Richard took place at Chez Laurent, a French restaurant known for its quiet atmosphere and excellent soundproofing. Marcus arrived early with me, and we took a table near the back where we could talk without being overheard. Richard appeared precisely at 7, wearing a navy suit that was perfectly pressed but somehow looked less intimidating than his usual courtroom armor. He shook Marcus's hand warmly, an improvement over the polite distance he'd maintained during our dating years. We ordered wine and made small talk about the weather and the restaurant's reputation while we studied our menus. The conversation felt stilted, like 3 people performing roles they weren't sure they understood. "Tell me about the university position," Richard said after we'd ordered our meals. "Victoria mentioned you're going to be teaching." "Mentoring, primarily. Working with students who are interested in cybersecurity but might not have traditional support systems. First-generation college students, women in tech, people whose families might not understand their career choices. Like you," he said quietly. "Like I was, yes. What will you teach them?" I'd expected questions about salary, prestige, career advancement. Instead, he seemed genuinely curious about the content of the work. Technical skills, obviously, but also how to navigate professional environments where they might be underestimated, how to build confidence when they're surrounded by people who don't look like them, how to define success on their own terms rather than accepting other people's definitions. That last one sounds particularly challenging. I looked at him across the table, trying to determine whether he understood the personal implications of that statement. It is. Most of us spend years trying to prove ourselves to people who've already decided we're not worth their attention. Learning to value your own opinion over external validation is difficult.
But necessary, Marcus added, speaking for the first time since we'd been seated. Very necessary, I agreed. Some of my students will go home for holidays and try to explain why they're majoring in computer science instead of something their parents consider more appropriate for women. Others will start internships at companies where they're the only people who look like them in the room. They need to know that their worth isn't determined by other people's ability to understand their choices. Richard was quiet for several minutes, processing information that clearly related to more than just my teaching philosophy. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. How do you help them build that confidence? By showing them examples of success that look like their own experiences, by connecting them with professionals who faced similar challenges, by teaching them that innovation often comes from perspectives that others haven't considered, and by demonstrating that it's possible to build something extraordinary even when the people closest to you don't believe in what you're doing, Marcus said, his tone gentle but pointed. Especially then, I agreed, meeting Richard's eyes across the table. Our meals arrived, providing a natural break in the conversation. As we ate, Richard asked detailed questions about cybersecurity threats, emerging technologies, and the specific skills my students would need to succeed in the field. His questions were informed and thoughtful, demonstrating that he'd done significant research since our library meeting. I've been reading about artificial intelligence applications in cybersecurity, he said. Some experts argue that AI will eventually replace human analysts, while others believe human intuition will always be necessary for complex threat assessment. What's your opinion? The question sparked a 20-minute discussion about machine learning, pattern recognition, and the irreplaceable value of human creativity in solving novel problems. For the first time in my adult life, I found myself in a genuine intellectual conversation with my father, one where he listened to my expertise without trying to diminish or redirect it. You know, he said as we waited for dessert, I understand now why you chose this field. It's not just about computers and code. It's about protecting people, preventing disasters, solving problems that most people don't even know exist. It's the kind of work that requires both technical brilliance and moral conviction. It's work that matters, I said simply, like law in some ways, using specialized knowledge to protect people who can't protect themselves. The comparison hadn't occurred to me before, but he was right. Both our careers involved using complex skills to prevent harm, to solve problems, to serve people who trusted us with their safety. The difference was that Richard's work was public and recognized, while mine had been invisible by design. Maybe that's why I was so confused by your choice, he continued. I kept looking for external markers of success, public recognition, traditional career progression, visible achievement. I didn't understand that some of the most important work happens behind the scenes. Most cybersecurity professionals work in anonymity, I said. We succeed when nothing bad happens, when systems function smoothly, when threats are neutralized before anyone knows they existed. It's not the kind of career that generates newspaper headlines or social media praise. Until now, I agreed, but the visibility is new. The work has always been there. We finished our meal with plans to meet again in 2 weeks, a tentative step toward regular contact. As we prepared to leave, Richard reached into his jacket and withdrew a small wrapped package. I wanted to give you something, he said, his uncertainty evident in how carefully he chose his words. It's not much, and I know it doesn't make up for anything, but I thought you might like to have it. Inside the wrapping was a photograph I hadn't seen in decades. My mother, Richard, and me at my 8th grade science fair, standing beside a project about computer programming that had won first place. I was grinning at the camera, holding my blue ribbon, while both my parents smiled proudly on either side of me. I found it when I was cleaning out my office, Richard said. I'd forgotten that you were interested in technology even then. You wrote a program that could calculate prime numbers, and you were so excited to explain how it worked. I was proud of you that day. I stared at the photograph, remembering the girl who'd stayed up late learning basic programming from library books, who'd been convinced that her father would finally understand her passion if she could just win that science fair. She'd been right for that one day. And then life had moved on, the divorce had happened, and that moment of shared pride had been buried under years of misunderstanding. Thank you, I said, meaning more than just the photograph.
I want to be that father again, he said, the one who was proud of you for being curious and brilliant and determined. I know I can't undo the years when I wasn't, but maybe I can learn to be that person going forward. I looked at this man who'd caused me so much pain and was now asking for the chance to cause me less. The anger I'd carried for so long hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something more complex, less consuming. What remained wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but the possibility of it. "We'll see," I said, which was the most honest answer I could give. 3 months later, I stood in a university classroom looking out at 35 students who represented the future of cybersecurity. They were diverse in every way that mattered: race, gender, economic background, family expectations, and personal dreams. What they shared was curiosity, determination, and the kind of brilliance that often went unrecognized by people who didn't know how to see it. "How many of you have family members who understand what you're studying?" I asked as an opening question. 5 hands went up out of 35. "How many of you have been told that your career choice is impractical, too difficult, or inappropriate for someone with your background?" 28 hands rose. "Perfect," I said, and meant it. "Then you're exactly the people who need to be in this room." I told them about Phoenix Security Solutions, about building a company in secret while my own family dismissed my capabilities. I showed them the photograph Richard had given me, the 8th grader who dreamed of using technology to solve problems. I explained how that girl had become a woman who'd prevented disasters while remaining invisible, and how stepping into the light required more courage than any code she'd ever written. "Your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to understand your achievements," I told them. "The most important innovations often come from perspectives that others haven't considered, from people who see problems differently because they've lived different experiences." In the back row, a young woman raised her hand. "But what if they never understand? What if your family always sees you as a disappointment?" The question cut straight to the heart of my own journey, the pain that had motivated years of anonymous success. "Then you have a choice," I said. "You can spend your energy trying to prove yourself to people who've decided not to see you, or you can use that energy to build something that reflects your actual values and capabilities. The approval you're seeking from others is something you can give yourself." "But doesn't it hurt, being dismissed by people you love?" "It hurts tremendously," I admitted. "But the alternative, hiding your talents, diminishing yourself, choosing smaller dreams to avoid disappointing people who are already disappointed, hurts more. At least when you're true to yourself, the pain has meaning." After class, I walked across campus to meet Richard at the coffee shop, where we'd been meeting monthly since our dinner at Chez Laurent. He was already there, reading a book about cybersecurity ethics that I'd recommended. "How did the first day of classes go?" he asked as I sat down with my latte.
Inspiring, challenging. These students are going to change the world, but most of them don't know it yet. Like their professor did. I smiled at the comparison. I hope they do it with less family drama. "Speaking of family drama," he said, closing his book, "Elena and I have been talking. We'd like to host a dinner party next month. Nothing elaborate, just a chance for you and Marcus to meet some of our friends, for us to introduce them to our accomplished daughter." The offer was complicated, loaded with decades of history and the possibility of performative pride. But it was also an attempt at inclusion, a chance for Richard to publicly claim me in a way he'd never been willing to do before. "What's the real reason?" I asked. He considered the question seriously. "I want people to know who you are. For 30 years, when colleagues asked about my children, I talked about Victoria's achievements and barely mentioned you. I want the chance to correct that record. And if I embarrass you, if I say something that reveals how little you actually know about my work or how long you've been dismissing it, then I'll deserve the embarrassment," he said. "Sarah, I'm not asking you to pretend that our relationship has been perfect. I'm asking for the chance to show that I'm learning to be better." I thought about the students I'd met that morning, about the courage it took to claim space in rooms where you weren't initially welcome, about the choice between hiding and stepping into visibility despite the risks. "One dinner party," I agreed. "But Marcus and I choose what we share about our work and our lives. You don't get to script the conversation to make yourself look better. I wouldn't want you to." The dinner party took place on a Saturday evening in October, with 12 guests who represented Richard's professional and social circles. I wore a blue dress that complemented the photograph from my science fair, a small reminder of the girl who'd believed her father could be proud of her intellectual achievements. Elena had prepared an elegant meal, and the conversation ranged from local politics to recent legal cases to travel plans. When someone inevitably asked about my work, I explained Phoenix Security Solutions without minimizing its scope or importance. I talked about the students I was mentoring, the cases that had shaped my career, and the satisfaction of preventing disasters that would otherwise destroy lives and livelihoods. Richard listened without interrupting, occasionally adding details about recent news stories related to cybersecurity. He didn't try to take credit for my success or claim that his parenting had somehow contributed to my achievements. Instead, he simply bore witness to the truth of who I'd become. "You must be incredibly proud," one guest said to Richard during dessert. "I am," he replied, "though I wish I'd been smart enough to recognize her achievements sooner." The admission was public and honest, an acknowledgement of his failure that didn't try to minimize its impact or excuse its duration. It was the closest thing to a public apology I was likely to receive, and more than I'd expected when I'd agreed to attend. After the guests left, Elena excused herself to load the dishwasher while Richard walked Marcus and me to our car. "Thank you for coming," he said, "for giving me the chance to introduce you properly." "Thank you for not trying to rewrite history," I replied. "I want to understand something," he said as I unlocked the car door. "The night you saved my law firm from those hackers, you spent hours protecting a business owned by someone who'd spent years dismissing your capabilities. Why didn't you let us face the consequences of our own security failures?" I considered the question that went to the heart of who I'd chosen to become despite his influence rather than because of it. "Because your clients didn't deserve to suffer for your mistakes," I said. "Because your employees needed their jobs, and because the right thing to do isn't dependent on whether people have treated you well. You're a better person than I am." "I'm a different person than you are," I corrected, "and maybe that's enough." The drive home was quiet, both Marcus and I processing an evening that had felt like a small miracle after years of family dysfunction. As we pulled into our driveway, I realized that the weight I'd been carrying since childhood had shifted again, not disappeared, but transformed into something more manageable. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked as we settled into our living room. "Different," I said. The same answer I'd given after the press conference months ago. Still hurt by the past, but less defined by it. Like maybe I can have a relationship with him without needing him to become someone he's never been. That's progress. It's something. 6 months later, I received an email that would have once filled me with desperate hope and now simply brought a smile to my face. Richard had forwarded an article from the local business journal about Phoenix Security Solutions, adding a note that read, "Thought you might like to see this coverage of your latest contract. I've been telling everyone at the firm about my daughter, the cybersecurity expert. I hope that's okay." I forwarded the email to Victoria, who responded within minutes. "Dad's been insufferable about bragging about you lately. It's actually kind of sweet." The transformation wasn't complete or perfect. Richard still occasionally lapsed into old patterns of trying to manage conversations or minimize emotional complexity. I still struggled with trusting his motives and accepting his pride without resentment about its timing. But we were building something new on the foundation of honest acknowledgement about what had been broken. My students thrived under mentorship that emphasized their inherent worth rather than their need to prove themselves to others. Several of them had already secured internships at major tech companies, carrying with them the confidence that their perspectives were valuable rather than problematic. Phoenix Security Solutions continued to grow, now operating openly with my name attached to every innovation and contract. The visibility brought new challenges: media scrutiny, competitor analysis, government oversight, but it also brought the satisfaction of receiving credit for work that had always mattered. The story could have ended with Richard's shocked recognition at the press conference, with his pale face as he realized how wrong he'd been about his worthless daughter. That moment had certainly been satisfying, a vindication I'd dreamed about for years. But the real ending was quieter, more complex, and ultimately more meaningful. It was the choice to build something new, rather than remaining defined by old wounds. It was learning that forgiveness could coexist with boundaries, that love could coexist with accountability, that family relationships could be rebuilt without pretending they'd never been broken.
The girl who'd practiced conversations with her father in the car had finally found her voice, and when she used it to tell her story, the whole world listened. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.